Almost frozen into his saddle, Ridge Tisdale was cold down to the bone and questioned his intelligence for being out in the icy wind howling across the open Texas prairie. Falling snow whipped in tornado-like swirls and settled on what had already collected. Drifts formed on anything that caught the flakes. Many of those drifts resembled ocean swells, while others were sculpted into sharp, solid waves. He'd rather have been inside a nice, warm building somewhere, or at the very least sheltered by something substantial beside the life-giving heat of a mesquite campfire. Instead, he was headed for the town of Blackjack. It was difficult to see through the falling weather that isolated his world, and he relied on Rebel to get them there. The buckskin's hooves landed with a soft plop on the snow, and the gelding had so much bottom he'd walk without complaint as long as his rider wanted. Ridge did little but huddle inside his thick sheepskin coat and wish for a glowing stove, a cup of steaming coffee so hot it would scald a hog, and a beefsteak that was still bleeding. A yellow and black silk scarf protruded from under his hat, covering his ears and disappearing inside the coat. Pulled low on his forehead, the stained felt hat stopped just above his eyebrows and collected snow. A second scarf covered his nose and lower face, making him look like a road agent in search of victims. He reached out with a gloved hand and patted Rebel's neck. The deerskin gloves had been one of his only splurges before leaving Austin. The old men sitting in the late summer sun that day were discussing the aches and pains of rheumatism that awoke with the coming weather. The oldest, with hair down to his shoulders and a white beard reaching nearly to his waist, held up one hand full of knobby knuckles and told the others how his hands had barely survived the winter of 1840, protected by a pair of deerskin gloves he'd gotten in trade with an old Caddo woman. Something in the man's story told Ridge to hie on over to a leather shop and pick up a similar pair of gloves. He thanked the old man's stories and his gnarly hands for the inspiration. The only part of Ridge's body exposed to the harsh elements were his squinting eyes, and he wished for something to cover them. The buckskin pretty much had his head, at first following a game trail until it disappeared under the snow. Once enough had fallen, there was little to mark the trace, and the only way Ridge knew they were going in the right direction was the wind blowing hard out of the north. A week out of Gainesville, Texas, he adjusted the thick collar protecting the back of his neck and felt the horse hesitate. Ridge studied what little he could see in front of him and realized they'd intersected a wagon trace leading off in the general direction they were headed.